So, Jason, we're here today to talk about probably the best album from the worst genre of music imaginable. Would you agree?
I would agree wholeheartedly.
We're talking, of course, if you haven't already gathered it from the title of the video, about LD50 by Mudvayne. So, stick around, it's going to be a hoot. So, yeah, LD50. I don't know about you, but I have very fond memories of this album. This came out right around the time when I had started collecting CDs, and I think it was one of the first albums I bought with my own money. Not the first, but one of the first ones. And it's at least to me, it's such a weird album. There's so many things that are going for it, and I think there's a couple things that work against it, which we'll get into, that kind of date the album in a negative way. But I mean, by and large, I think it's a representation of how out there Mudvayne was for that period of time. And even though they get lumped in with all the other bands, I think they're really doing some different stuff.
Yeah, absolutely. Well, so it's kind of funny you say that. If I remember correctly, I think this record came out in 2000, right?
Yeah, August 23rd, 2000.
2000, okay,
Yeah.
so 22 years old this year, which is crazy to think about, because I remember the records I was buying in 2000. And, we're only a few years apart, but I was kind of in a similar boat, starting to develop my own taste in music at that point, beyond the hand-me-down CDs. And obviously, my musical background was in a lot of kind of like, the skate punk and pop punk bands, and that's what I started developing my taste in beyond like the rock bands that my parents were listening to. So it's funny because I can totally imagine, young Kyle going into the Circuit City or whatever and buying LD50. I was the guy buying Hybrid Theory.
Also a great album.
Also a great album, but
Yeah.
kind of funny because, I think there's that, I'm not going to say genre misunderstanding, but when you think of the, term nu metal, right, there's a few bands that instantly come to mind. And that era, stylistically, not only the visual style, but also the musical style. So it's funny because before we get into, like, the details of the album, this was one of those where beyond the singles, I never really dove too deep into Mudvayne. And it was funny because it was actually you many years ago. We were joking about, nu metal and whatever, and I remember saying like, oh yeah, it's just, silly BS stuff like Mudvayne or whatever, and you said, wait a minute, man, you couldn't be more wrong. And I said, well, what do you mean, Dig, blah, 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 whatever. Thinking back to when I heard Dig in 2000, and I wasn't a musician yet, and I didn't, wasn't a listener of music, or at least try to consume music in a little bit more, go a little bit deeper with it, right?
Right.
And I just, I remember that first listen as an adult, as a musician, as a writer, composer, whatever, producer of music, listening to that record 15 years later blew my mind, because holy shit, it's not what you would think.
No, it isn't at all. It's something. And like, I gotta say, I think that Dig, the song in the video specifically, which I don't know if you remember where you were the first time you saw that video, but it's kind of glued in my brain. I
Cracked
think
the Mountain Dew after school,
Code Red, yeah, specifically.
kicked off my Vans.
Turned off Tony Hawk's Pro Skater for a second.
Yeah.
But no, I do think that Dig was probably the worst thing for Mudvayne in 2000. I can't say the worst thing, because I mean, it did launch their career, that video, that song, which is a great fucking song. But I think that, what it did to help their career, it's kind of the same thing that happened with Extreme when More Than Words came out. Everybody heard More Than Words and they're thinking like, okay, this one snippet is what Extreme is all about, which it definitely wasn't. I think it's the same thing with Mudvayne. So I think to that extent it may have hindered them in the long run, but you've got the internet, which remains undefeated, and they bring Berber Dang back as a thing a few years ago, and now it's cool because there's all of these kids. I hate to use the word kids, but I'm going to use the word kids, but a younger generation kind of getting into it. And it kind of sucks because it's like, oh yeah, meme Berber Dang, devil horns on, made out of hair, but I do think it is serving as a good catalyst to introduce people back into what Mudvayne is now that they're back. If you haven't seen, they've done a few touring dates, I think, with festivals last year, and they've got some more lined up for this year,
reunited in 2021.
Which is awesome. So I don't know how directly you can you know attribute them returning to Berber Dang, but I think in the long run it's just funny the path that it took to get them where they are now.
Oh, sure, yeah. And I mean, so much of that, too, in that era, specifically from, like, late 90s to early 2000s, with a lot of the bands that were kind of, you'd say, like, Mudvayne's contemporaries, the Korns, the Slipknots, to an extent Linkin Park, to an extent Disturbed, a lot of those bands get lumped into that same category of nu metal. It's interesting because it's such a broad genre if you don't add the visual component. If
Absolutely.
you just listen to it, if you put a playlist together and you add all of those bands' big records, for as much as it gets lumped in together, it all sounds different. They all had, for better or worse. Now, I'm not necessarily saying that this isn't like, we're planting the flag defensive nu metal as a genre, because there's a lot of shit in there. But
a lot of shit.
I feel like someone like myself who, beyond just kind of a passing glance at it, I think the visual was tied to it, which, as you said, I think helped and hindered Mudvayne in a lot of ways. When you remove that element, there's a lot going on musically. A lot going on.
Well, and it's interesting. You've got the whole troupe of bands that came out late 90s, early 2000s that were doing the nu metal thing and had makeup or masks or something like that. And I think there was a lawsuit back in the day that Mushroomhead had filed against Slipknot for the masks and this and that, and just a whole bunch of really silly shit going on. But it's easy to lump Mudvayne in with that, and you get to thinking like, okay, what came first? Did they do the face paint as like a reactionary type of thing? Were they one of the first people in there? And what I found out when looking up different details on the album, well, I found a few different things. First, I guess we'll go through some of the technical details. So, a surprisingly A-list production and engineering staff for this album, which I do think says a lot to the potential that the label saw in Mudvayne. Not that labels are the end-all be-all, but ultimately they were signed to No Name, which is a subsidiary of Epic, which like, you think late 90s, early 2000s, Epic was it. Yeah. But Garth Richardson on production, Dean Mayer, Steve Richards. But the thing that really jumped out to me that I didn't realize was that one of the executive producers on this was Sean Cram from Slipknot.
Yeah, I read that as well.
Which, to me is kind of like, oh, maybe, he was kind of behind the scenes, helping steer the ship a little bit. Aside from that, Steve Sisko, Scott Turnin, Andrew Wall. The last two here for mixing and mastering, Andy Wallace and Howie Weinberg, which you look at their discographies, which we'll put some of it on the screen now. But if you made a hard rock heavy metal album in the late 90s, early 2000s, chances are some permutation of that group was behind the scenes with it. But yeah, founded in 96 in Peoria. I think most of the guys are from Central Illinois. I think Chad might be from Rockford, if I read the credits right. But it's interesting, man. You've got again, just indicative of that era, you've got a heavy metal band from the Midwest dressing like a bunch of weirdos, making heavy angsty music. But as the album goes along, there's a whole lot of cool stuff that they do that I don't think anybody before them, at least in that corner of music, really tried to do, and nobody's really tried to do since.
Yeah, no, totally. Well, a few things that really struck me, just and obviously too, with a lot of the technical details you just listed off, production. Like, you talk like Andy Wallace, like even still today, a lot of the kind of bigger productions, rock and metal productions, have been graced by his presence and his team. And it really struck me going back to this, especially listening on a really good pair of headphones, how good it sounds even today. 22 years later, like, great separation, great production overall, and you can really hear that that production kind of putting that sheen on it, but not in a sheen that makes it any less organic, because I think the playing really still comes through.
Yeah.
The other thing that really struck me is this album's an hour plus long. It's 68 minutes long.
It's a long album.
And that really got me because, you know, you think of like these little bite-sized bits of aggression you have with like Dig and, you know, some of the other tracks on the album. And well, I'll talk about that more because I think that's a pro and a con, but I'm always taken back to like, you know, think like the early 90s when a lot of major labels were experimenting with, you know, different bands that were putting out really weird records. The one that always comes to mind is Faith No More.
Sure.
Angel Dust. Like, what a weird record for a major label to put. Even today, you listen back then and you say, what were they thinking? Like, it's great music. It's really cool, you know, to an extent, like a lot of the Bungle stuff. And obviously same players, but or a few of the same players. But to me, that's kind of the interesting thing is this almost feels, in some regard, like an extension of that in a way, and definitely an album you couldn't get away with in 2022 on a major.
I think so, yeah, and I don't know if it's recency bias or what, but I do feel like you can kind of see the lack of tolerance for risk in heavy music, especially, kind of waning over the years. What?
There's a telephone pole in the alley on fire. Our neighbor came and told us, but she said we might lose power because NIPSCO's coming out. Just wanted to give you a heads up.
All right, cool.
Grip it and rip it. We're going to finish this up real quick. You leave that in. Hey, there's a telephone pole in the alleyway.
Fucking hey, man. I think you can kind of see a progression through the years of, you know, the lack of risk tolerance in heavy music, especially with what at least major labels are willing to put out there. I mean, I think one of the good things is there's a lot of people self-publishing and self-producing nowadays. So you still have a ton of really different music out there, but like I think it's a fair statement to say that Mudvayne wouldn't have been as big as they were, and still are for that matter, if they didn't have a major label throwing some weight behind them.
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah, because that's the thing too, is for as technical and aggressive as a lot of the music is, it still does have those hooks, and it still does have those kind of soft moments that you can see that the commercial appeal there.
Absolutely.
So I think it really rode that line well in being something that was palatable for the major, you know, or subsidiary of the major label, to where they had that type of resource put into them, or that sort of backing put into them, whereas, you know, an independent metal band doing weird stuff might not necessarily have the same degree of support, but at the same time, you know, they certainly on those early records had that vision and were kind of allowed to see that vision through to fruition, which is refreshing, because, not to say, as you said, it's not that it doesn't exist today. I just think it's a lot more few and far between.
Yeah, absolutely. Well, and especially when you juxtapose Mudvayne against their contemporaries, right? You've got Slipknot, which, you know, is, I mean, I still love Slipknot, but they're a very different animal than what Mudvayne is, and, you know, even what early Mudvayne was compared to late Mudvayne. And you've got, you know, obviously the ones that I don't really care for. You've got Mushroom Head and Seven Dust and all those bands. But it's interesting the way, and I guess this gets into some of the things that really make Mudvayne unique, is that it's so weird. So you almost have, I like to think of it as a reverse power trio, right? You've got Chad Gray, which I guess as a side note, probably one of the more dynamic vocalists in that genre. Corey Taylor, great metal vocalist. He can do some clean stuff. He can do really good guttural vocals, but it's kind of like an on-off switch, right? Not a whole lot of in-between, except for some fleeting moments. But listening to some of these tunes, especially, what was it? Severed. And it's like, wow, there's like a lot of soaring, clean vocals in it. And that's something that I definitely think they capitalized on more as they went along. You listen to End of All Things to Come, they're self-titled, and I definitely think they geared, I don't know if they geared some, you know, more of their songwriting, or if it just happened, but you get a little bit more palatable, digestible sound as they go along. But, you know, the first time you listen through LD50, you're probably expecting, you know, if all you heard was Dig, you're probably expecting just screaming, and there's not. There's a lot of really interesting blends and dynamics that he does with his voice. But anyways, not to get too far off topic, I think one of the really interesting things for me is the interplay between Ryan Martini and Greg Tribbett, to where normally in that situation you'd have a bass player just kind of laying it down and letting the guitar player take up all the notes. And as much crap as I feel like Greg Tribbett gets, he's a good guitar player. He's got a good pocket, and I think he understands where in Mudvayne sonically he should be fitting in with everything else. And it's just as much an art and a skill, for that matter, to be able to orchestrate your guitar playing in a way that serves the song, right? You could almost call him,
Yeah, absolutely.
He is to that band what's his face, Valentine is to Maroon 5.
Yeah, totally. Well, and it's funny you said that too, because that reminded me of a conversation we had a long time ago. I very much cut from the cloth of the busy riff and busy arrangement, and kind of not at least you don't try to do it to your detriment or the detriment of the song. I've certainly learned that over the years, but I remember early on when you and I started writing music together over a decade ago now, you were a big proponent of like Lacuna Coil and a lot of those bands that really strive for that orchestration, even if on the surface level it isn't the most technical thing. They're not, Greg Tribbett's not ripping arpeggios in a lot of these LD50 songs, if at all. A lot of the times he's, hanging on a root note, or the songs are very riffy, but I think it's having that dynamic where it's kind of viewed as like the master staff, right? It's not just, oh, I'm writing my guitar part and the bassist is going to follow the kick drum and whatever. It's much more of that arrangement really taking the focus. And I think that's why that part of what makes the album as strong as it is, because it really does feel like a group effort. There's no, obviously the bass playing is phenomenal, the drumming is phenomenal, the vocals are phenomenal, but it's really that interplay between those musicians that makes that record and makes those songs what they are.
Absolutely. I think it's a talent knowing that you've got one of the better metal bassists in your band, and that's not to undercut him, but I mean, Ryan Martini, I feel like he's probably who most people from a musician aspect gravitate to in that band. And I mean, it's easy to see why he's got such a unique way of playing. His parts are busy, but again, in a way that serve the song. It's not, trying to squeeze in slap bass on a part that doesn't call for it. It's dynamic, it's got good groove, and I think you pair that with, Greg Tribbett and then also Matthew McDonough on drums, who, again, he's not blasting at 300 beats a minute, but he has more of a Lars Ulrich style approach. And before you slap me across the face, let me explain what I mean. His composition and the way he arranges his drum parts help make the rhythmic side of it, what's the best way to describe it? I feel like it serves as a good bridge between what the guitar is doing and what the bass is doing. The bass is arguably the most technical, notey involved thing going on. There's a lot of really cool phrasing things that the drums do to tie all that together and kind of flip phrases around on their heads and make it really exciting to listen to.
Yeah, I completely agree. And I know that the bass is definitely always a highlight that's brought up, but I personally, for what I listened to and what I listened for, I thought the drumming was phenomenal.
Yeah.
There are some elements here, and it's hard to like pinpoint exact parts in songs, but some stuff where, I mean, it's funny, we're listening to this band from 2000 that gets lumped in with all these other kind of aggro metal bands, whatever. And there's some really sophisticated rhythmic stuff going on. I mean, there's some stuff that, like, I'm sure a lot of bands that are popular in the scene or in the genre today would be, maybe some of them would wear it as a point of pride that, yeah, they were influenced by Mudvayne and a lot of those bands that were kind of progenitors of a lot of those sounds. But there's probably a lot that wouldn't, and they owe a lot to what was going on back then, because there's a lot of really cool rhythmic interplay and polyrhythms and stop-start type, riffs that are going on they still sound fresh.
Yeah, absolutely.
Even in a genre where a lot of that's been done to death, especially now. So
So the overall history of Mudvayne, really interesting in terms of there's not a lot of details around there, or really interesting because there's not a whole lot of details out there as to why they broke up initially or went on hiatus, aside from they just got over it, I guess. And which, I mean, is totally valid. You know, at that point, 2009, I think, right? Or 2009 is when their last album came out, so it must have been shortly after that. But you know, you figure at a minimum 13 years they've been doing the thing, been touring, and they put out a lot of work in that short amount of time. They had 4 studio albums, I think, 2 or 3 EPs. So, you know, the creative juices were flowing. And, you know, I don't know what came first, if it was that or if it was, the idea of Hell Yeah being formed that maybe seemed to be something fresh. But, you know, it's interesting kind of the path that their overall sound took. There's definitely elements, like, I don't think there's a Mudvayne album that you can say doesn't sound like Mudvayne, but in the same way that Leprous has still sound like Leprous throughout the years, but where they focus their energy kind of changes in the sound. I feel like it's kind of the same type of thing, you know.
Yeah, yeah. Well, it's funny to me because with Mudvayne, you know, after you kind of initially told me, hey, give them a chance, you know, I did. So then, you know, kind of checked out some of their older discography. And it's funny, it's like, I almost find I have a reverse Slipknot going on with them. And what I mean by that is, I enjoyed their earlier material more than I enjoyed their later material. I thought their sound kind of, although it still retained something of that core of what they were or who they were early on, diluted maybe is a strong word, but I feel like the sound definitely did change, and it changed to where it wasn't quite to my liking anymore.
Sure.
Or at least where they developed it, it wasn't where I necessarily wanted to see them go. But
Sure.
at that point, it was already 10 years after the fact, right? So it doesn't matter. They had been broken up for 5 or 6 years by the time I checked them out. But Slipknot, I feel like, is interesting where, you know, a lot of those early albums that are heralded as like the genre classics, I don't really care for as much. I feel like I really liked when they kind of, and they were running parallel, right? So we're talking about like a lot of those albums like Volume 3, and we talk about like what is it, All Hope Is Gone. I really enjoyed those records a lot.
Sure.
And to me, those would be the ones I would probably point to before I pointed to an Iowa or a self-titled. Whereas I feel like the opposite is true with Mudvayne. I felt like LD50, and the name escapes me, but the record after that.
Oh, End of All Things.
End of All Things. That was it. Yep. I really enjoyed those records, and I thought that was a really. Those were both strong statements. I think more so than what would come afterwards.
I mean, when you get a song picked out to be the closing credits for Ghost Ship, like, you know you've made it at that point. No, well, I think the other interesting thing too is the evolution of their look, which always kind of intrigued me. And it wasn't like, are we going to change masks for this tour and this album cycle? We're going to, like, they tried to have some type of theatrical something going on with how they changed their look throughout the course of the years. They did, obviously, the traditional face paints early on. They did the weird alien bug eyes for End of All Things to Come. And it kind of progressed as it went along until, I think, on their self-titled album, they were just doing them up there, maybe a little bit of guy liner, and not really a whole lot of presentation, which, I mean, maybe they got burned out. But it's interesting because after that, you know, the band goes separate ways. Ryan Martini and McDonough do their own thing. Obviously, Greg Tribbett and Chad go into Hell Yeah and do that thing, which to me almost kind of feels like a facade a little bit. I mean, far be it from me to say that something is or isn't natural, but it was always interesting, like, thinking about those two guys pairing up with Vinnie Paul to make that kind of music. But
to me, I kind of took that as a commercial move more than anything else.
Sure.
You know, I think it's like they'd certainly developed a platform and kind of built a career for themselves. And if they knew that Mudvayne had run its course for the time being, it seemed like with those industry connections or friendships that they made, I'm assuming with, you know, Vinnie Paul and obviously someone of his stature and deservedly so in the metal scene, it would seem like, hey, you know, let's do this thing, you know, and
well, this is how we die. This is great. And we're back. The utility company has come and pulled the charred, smoldering possum corpses from the light posts, and we have power again. And, you know, by the grace
15
of
hours later.
you know what? Not God's will or a substandard power grid is going to stop us from completing this discussion, Jason. But anyway, where we left off before we were interrupted, we were talking about, kind of the progression of the band, and I think, what led to Chad and Greg going into Hell Yeah and then leaving it. But anyways, my point with all that was it's interesting seeing the progression of the band. They started off with all the makeup. They kind of slowly devolved until they went on hiatus. Then after Hell Yeah wraps up and they come back in 2021 and they're doing festival dates, now they're in full makeup again and really kind of embracing, I guess you could call it the retro era of the band. So that kind of progression, I think, is interesting to see. And I don't know if it says anything or what it says about the band, but at least from my end, I thought that was kind of cool.
Yeah, definitely. Yeah, I think it kind of taps into some of that too, that nostalgia factor. But at the same time, like, who knows? Maybe if they had more commercial aspirations, or they had that desire to kind of sustain a different type of career coming off of those early Mudvayne records, like maybe they did that, and maybe they got that kind of out of their system, and maybe we'll get LD 51. Who knows? I mean, maybe there'll be kind of a return to that sort of songwriting, or that sort of atmosphere on new stuff. I mean, it's too early to tell. They haven't really detailed their plans on whether they're just, playing live now again, or they're going to start working on new music. I think they've really insisted that they ended the hiatus. So I think they're, it's easy to look at them as an active band again, which is, great. But yeah, I'd be really curious to see. And I'm also curious, if they do any sort of touring or anything else like that, in like a headliner capacity, where they're not playing like a one-off fest, but they're actually moving through the states. How and what their playlists will be, or set lists will be skewed to. Will it be a lot of early stuff? Will it be more of an exploration of the hits? Will they be playing any new songs? So I'd be curious to see. But it seems like they're starting that new era, hopefully with fresh eyes and ears, and that fresh creativity that sometimes those long hiatuses can kind of impart. So the world is their oyster again. I think the market is definitely there in our aging millennial age group here. So
yeah, man, I would give anything to see new Mudvayne music at some point in the next 2 to 3 years, well, ever really, but in the next 2 to 3 years, that would be awesome. And like you said, it would be interesting to see what type of sound they have and come back with, now being, over a decade removed from their last album. And even though they've maintained kind of a consistent sound, which I'm trying to think, we've spent a lot of time talking about where they fit in with their contemporaries and this and that. And I'm trying to think of the best comp, and I'm thinking across the music genres that I know and I'm comfortable with, at least. And I I can't really think of anything, and you're going to slap me for saying this, but I honestly think the closest comp for Mudvayne is Starship Troopers. Really any Paul Verhoeven movie, but Starship Troopers specifically, to where if you're a complete knuckle dragging moron, there's something in there for you to grasp onto and to really appreciate. But if you choose to look deeper than, face value, and try to dig into, and I'm talking about the music now, either the playing or the song structure or the time signatures or how dynamic the vocal is or the production, any of that, the more you get into it, the cooler it is. And it becomes apparent that there was really a lot of thought put into this. And this isn't 4 dudes from Peoria chugging Monster Energy drinks and, going and crushing it in the garage in their Marshall stacks,
yeah, I like that. I'm going to use that from now on too. I think knuckle knuckle dragging moron metal.
But
I definitely want to orient any of my future songs towards that towards that
yeah, no,
demographic. But I get what you're saying.
yeah, I mean, we'll get to Five Finger Death Punch in a later video, but it does, I think, kind of, it's interesting. But anyways, I think this may be a good time to talk about some of the aspects of the album a little bit more in depth, and so that we can end on a positive note, because my intent is, and I don't think yours either, is like our intent isn't to shit on contemporary bands, even though it's not our favorite type of music. So I think we should end with the highlights of the album for us, but let's talk about a couple of things that may keep this, or may have held this album back a little bit, because as much as I love this album, it's not a perfect album, I don't think. It has a couple negative things going for it, but it has a lot of positive things. But anyways, what is your take on the negative side of this album?
Yeah, so kind of like what we talked about earlier in our discussion, I was really shocked to see when I revisited this in 2022 that the album is 68 minutes long. It's an hour plus. I've always kind of, and it's funny that we would say this too, us having released, several 80-minute long records in our, musical career. Use that term loosely, but it's interesting. But I definitely now, I think, have devised an appreciation for the 50-minute long LP. Like, I think
Sure.
that doesn't mean it's a 50-minute long album necessarily with 3-minute long songs. You can have a 10-minute long song, but I think just attention spans, it seems like that 45, 50 minutes for an LP is, if you can do it in that time frame, then you're already one step ahead of the game. Now, I know that a lot of the atmospherics and a lot of specifically the transitional tracks here that function as kind of those, segues into the next song, whatever, that's a big part of the identity of the album, right? It's there because I think that in some way, shape, or form kind of creates that atmosphere that they're trying to present on the album. So it's part, and as artists, I think we understand that that's as much of the intent as anything, as an actual song. If they included it, whether it's misguided or not, that is how they wanted to present their artistic vision. So I totally get that. But with the music itself, the songy songs, as it were, being as dense as they are already, adding that additional layer of density is just a lot. And it's kind of a hard album to, even for me, someone who's a huge fan of the album format and not skipping songs and not doing playlists and whatever. Like, I love putting an album on and listening to it from beginning to end. It's kind of tough to get through the whole record in just one go in 2022. Not to diminish the quality of the music within, but just, it's a lot. It's a lot. So I think that kind of hinders the album a bit. But again, I think the songwriting and the chances that they take and the creative kind of just tour de force that's on display make up for it. But if it was a band that wasn't as assured in their sound, I think the segues and a lot of that other stuff would drag it down to where it wasn't at that level it could be redeemed.
Sure. Yeah, no, I think that's a great point you bring up. For me, there's three things I think that keep this album from being a perfect album. The first one is what you brought up. It's a little bit on the long side, and most of the songs on there are really, really good. But, I think both of us being Cradle of Filth and Dimmu Borgir fans, like, we're, the obligatory intro track to the metal album is kind of something that's embraced by this point. We've got voiceovers by, who's the guy, Terrence McKenna, talking about psychedelics and everything. Like, okay, awesome, sign me up. Then you get to the fourth or fifth track or whenever the next one comes, and it's like, oh, okay, they're doing another one. Then you get 3/4 of the way through the album, and it's like another. It's like, okay, like maybe just one or two, and bookend the album with it, because it does get a little bit excessive at some points in a bad way. But I mean, a very minor complaint. I think if there's two other things for me personally, one would be the production. And I know you said that was a highlight of the album for you, and I will agree absolutely that for an album that comes out in 2000, The production on it is really good. It's just good in a way that I think dates the album a little bit. The comp I can think of is Breakfast in America. Uh, for me, one of my favorite albums of all time, a great mix. However, there can be times when you listen to it when the style of the mix and how they choose to EQ and compress different instruments dates it a little bit. And I'm interpreting that as a negative, maybe for some people that really rustles their jimmies. And I mean, if that's the case, more power to you. But I think for me, I would have liked to have heard, or I'd not like to have heard, because it's great. I'll still listen to the hell out of it. But I think it would be interesting if, that album could have been mixed more along the lines of the latter day albums in the mid to late 2000s, early 2010s, where you've got a little bit more tights, compressed type of tone. It cuts through a little bit better, especially with like the kick drums. I think sometimes can sound a little bit floppy. And then the last thing I think that works as a negative for me, and this may surprise you because I typically never listen to lyrics or pay much attention to them. The lyrics in a lot of these songs and spots are so angsty
Sure.
and very I guess dated would be the best word to use. It definitely harkens back to that, late 90s, early 2000s, angsty teenage type of attitude, which again is kind of endearing. But if we're looking at this album in a full retrospect and how people would interpret it, maybe listening to it for the first time in 2022, I do think, in the long run, there's parts of the lyrical content on it that kind of hold it back a little bit.
Yeah, no, I can agree with that one. I think that, on the lyric side, I am very much a lyrics, guy. I love reading lyrics. I love kind of interpreting them in my own way. I love writing lyrics. So, I mean, I understand that, it's difficult sometimes picking your subject matter. Is it going to be fantasy? Is it going to be personal, based topics? Is it going to be, really trying to deal with or grapple with things? Or is it going to be just more abstract,
Yeah.
And I think that it's funny because similar to like what we talked about a little bit ago, if you remove the visual element completely from the band, I feel like that's one of the things that really still ties them to that new metal movement. It was the visual and it was the lyrical content. Because musically, yeah, okay, they're doing chugs with down-tuned guitars, but there's so much more going on there. That I feel like the lyrical content and maybe some of the phrasing choices on the vocals, there's certainly some of that like syncopated kind of thing going on, but there's not like a lot of full blown rapping or like hip hop element that a lot of the contemporaries of Mudvayne at the time were really doing, where it's a full blown beat.
Yeah.
So yeah, no, I can definitely see that and agree.
Okay, so we've talked about some of the lowlights of the album. What from your end are some of the highlights of the album, tracks or otherwise?
Yeah, sure. So is it kind of an outlier? I want to say, is it Severed?
Mm-hmm.
So that's kind of my later album highlight. Just such a cool song, like just so, I don't know, just interesting, and I love the dynamics in that song a lot. Again, I think you pointed to a little bit ago. It points out a lot of the range of kind of emotional content, but also musical performance that those four dudes were able to kind of pull from their experience. But I'll be honest, I mean, even with the interludes, I think what a good, strong first like 4 or 5 songs on an album. What a strong way to start an album. I mean, I think that whole first like quarter of the record is just so impeccably arranged. And the that and we know that from our experiences with it. A track listing on a record is just as important as any other element of a record. If
Oh
you're
yeah.
not writing an album full of singles, and that's not your intent, if you're trying to produce a piece of art or produce a product that has, peaks and valleys and it has that roller coaster ride, that's very important. And I feel like you have to put a lot of stock into that. And I feel like they did that exceptionally well, because like
Absolutely.
Dig and like Internal Primates Forever, like, dude, just it's such a great such a great illustration of their sound and really what they were going for. So to me, that whole stretch of the record is a highlight. Not that there aren't other highlights on the album. Like I said, I pointed to a later record one as well with Severed, but I think that first 4, 5, 6 tracks are just total bangers through and through.
Absolutely. Yeah, no, I'd agree. You know, the 3 singles that came out for this are all great songs. Dig, obviously. I think Nothing to Gain was one of the other ones, and then
Yeah, that's a
Death
great track
Balloons.
too.
You know, all 3 of those great, and I think do encapsulate a portion of the sound. But some of my favorite outside of the singles, which I think, you know, in terms of choosing a point of entry, I can understand why they would choose all those songs. Internal Primates Forever is, if I have to take one Mudvayne song on a desert island with me, that's probably going to be the one. But there's so many other great ones. Everything and Nothing is one that stands out. Really good percussion performance on that. Cradle is great. No Forever. I mean, yeah, it's, you know, I guess to kind of put a cap on that, there's so many good songs on this album, and there's so many sounds that you wouldn't expect a band like Mudvayne to make if you've only seen them and never really, you know, dug in and listened to what they had to offer. So if you're on the fence about it, check it out. It's a great album. It really withstands the test of time. Again, not a perfect album, but I for one am really happy that they're making a comeback. And I mean, and it may be the algorithm that I've generated with doing a little bit of research on this album, but it feels like every week now there's a new reaction video coming out to Death Blooms or something else, and there's more people reacting to Mudvayne. So I'm excited to see that they're starting to get some traction in terms of the larger zeitgeist, and I'm hoping they keep up the performances and maybe even come out with some new music.
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah, I think, you know, this album would be a recommendation just based on the fact that, you know, you don't judge a book by its cover. I think we try to say that, we try to live by that kind of ethos, but at the same time, I think it's far too easy in music, especially modern music, contemporary music, whatever you want to say, to do exactly that and judge a book by its cover and say, oh, that's kind of goofy. They got this shtick, whatever. I'm sure it can't be good, or it can't be, you know, something that would interest me. And then if you find yourself in that situation where you have an afternoon and you say, hey, you know what, I'm going to go back and check out that record. I heard it was good, or, you know, one of my buddies said it was good, whatever. And you do, and then you make this musical discovery where, you know, for me, you can actually take that and then turn that into a new influence, which I think is always what I'm looking for out of music. So certainly a record that I never gave a chance for the better part of its existence, and the better part of my existence. But when I finally did, there was a lot of good stuff to uncover there. So it certainly changed my perspective on how I engage with music that maybe otherwise wouldn't be on paper my cup of tea. But in this case, turned out to be very much that.
Yeah, absolutely. Same here. So that's it. LD50 by Mudvayne. Check it out if you haven't already. If you have the opportunity to, check them out on tour at one of the festivals they'll be playing this year. Overall, a great album by, I think, an underappreciated band. So thanks for watching. Be sure to subscribe if you haven't already. We'll be coming out with new content pretty regularly. If you have any requests, put them in the comment section. We'll take a look at them. But yeah, we'll talk to you soon, everyone.
Thanks.
Thanks.